late last year, our member, Marian Spath, contacted us about having her family's story presented and added to our family history records. Over the past few months, Marian and I have corresponded by email, and she sent me the material and I agreed to present her work. Now, Marian became a member of the Pioneer Association in 1965 and served as our secretary in 2001. She then moved to Eugene, Oregon in 2002, where she lives now. Marian is 94 and has just recently been granted emeritus status with the Pioneers. She's also been a most generous donor to our association. So we are hoping that she's joining us today by Zoom. So if you're out there, Marian, hi. So to prepare for this presentation, I read books written by Marian's great-grandmother, Catherine Sager, and her great-aunt, Matilda Sager. To understand the family's indignation over the fictionalization of their story, I watched the movie Seven Alone, which was adapted from the book On to Oregon by Honora Morrow. Now, there are volumes of history about the Whitman massacre, but I'm not here to explore that. My promise to Marian is to tell her story, and so that's what I'll do now. Now, I'm reading Marian's words. The Sager Saga Retold by Marian Platz. Oh, there's the books. I already got behind. Okay. 6-year-old Catherine Sager, my maternal great-grandmother, broke her leg early in August 1844 when she jumped out of the family's wagon. Henry Sager moving his family again, but this time via the Oregon Trail. Earlier in May, traveling through Kansas, Henry's wife, Naomi, gave birth to her 7th child. Henry Sager, stricken with camp fever, died in August and was buried on the banks of the Green River in Wyoming. Naomi, suffering from sheer exhaustion and grief, died a few weeks later and was buried on the banks of the Snake River in Idaho. Another map. On the verge of death, each parent had implored the wagon master, Captain William Shaw, to take the children to the Whitman Mission at Wailapu, near the present-day city of Walla Walla, Washington. Even though the trip through the Blue Mountains would add many miles of hard travel to an already grueling journey, Shaw fulfilled their wishes. The orphans were eventually adopted by Marcus Whitman and were thrust into a life of relatively strict discipline that was lovingly administered by their new parents. Nevertheless, John Sager, a teenager, ran, upset by the change in his lifestyle. He did return, and Whitman received promises from him and his brother Frank to be dutiful. Following a relatively peaceful interlude, tragedy struck again in 1847 when the Whitman massacre erupted. Earlier that year, a measles epidemic spread by traveling pioneers killed many Cayuse tribal members whose method of treatment was not Dr. Whitman's. Blame of him was exaggerated by Native anxiety over increasing foreign encroachment on other tribal territories, an ominous sign of their own fate. A third contentious issue was the contrast between the Protestant and Catholic missions established in 1846, the priests sending mixed messages to the tribe. Sager boys, John and Frank, were shot during the massacre, and 6-year-old Hannah died from measles during the hostage sequel to the bloodletting. 11 victims were buried in a large common grave that had been dug by one of the men. The bodies, wrapped in ripped up sheets, were loaded on a cart and hauled away to the internment. A Catholic priest visiting a tribe assisted in the placing of the 11 bodies. That included both Whitmans and both Sager boys. Only Catherine, Matilda, Elizabeth, and Henrietta Sager survived. Rescued with other prisoners by Chief Factor Peter Skeen Ogden, had traveled from the Hudson Bay Fort in Vancouver. He negotiated release by purchasing the prisoners and taking them downriver to safety. Eventually landing in Salem, the 4 Sager women would marry. Catherine, now 16, wed Clark Pringle, son of Tabitha Brown, an Oregon pioneer who traveled in 1846 to be with her children's families in Salem. She is still honored for her help in establishing Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon. Catherine wrote an account some years after the massacre to describe the family's journey, the massacre, and afterwards. Today, it is regarded as one of the most authentic accounts of the American westward migration. That is a quote from Wikipedia article, The Sager Orphans. So, imagine the Sager descendants' dismay in 1926 when author Honora Morrow purported her new book, On to Oregon, was a true story. Her first myth was placing Whitman on a Missouri recruiting venture for families so he would lead back to Oregon. She further claimed that John Sager had run away from the wagon train, taking all of his siblings with him on a route to the mission. The myths prevailed through the book, later adapted for a movie and a TV program retitled 7 Alone. My mother, Calista Collins Platz, spent many years of her life countering this claim, and she found ammunition for her campaign when she learned Catherine's account was housed in the University of Washington Library archives. Edmund Meany, university president, granted her permission to enter the archives after her day job and type the contents for her own use. Armed with the true evidence, she recruited many allies, including Irwin Thompson, a superintendent at the Whitman National Monument, who wrote a visitor's pamphlet that was the true version. He also penned Shallow Grave at Wailapu, another true account of the Saga saga. Author Morrow never publicly changed her mind, and as late as 1994, a writer for Side Streets in the August 15th issue of the Eugene Register Guard praised the true story of the family of Henry and Naomi Sager. My mother, Calista, had a copy of the entire article in her files. I originally wrote this article because I was piqued about erroneous ancestral listing in the Pioneers Directory. But as I wrote, I realized the account would also honor my mother's determinations to discredit the lies. I also thought about the human cost paid by so many Oregon Trail pioneers, as well as the agonies of the many fallen in the Whitman massacre from both sides. I reflected on the Sager children being twice orphaned, the second time so horribly. Finally, I thought about today's cultural clashes, one already a new war in 2022. The photo found in Pioneer Hall is of the 3 surviving Sager sisters, Catherine, Matilda, and Elizabeth, who were honored guests at the 1897 50-year memorial for the whites who died in the massacre. the first such occasion. But the annual event was finally ended because of its one-sided content to honor the missionaries and ignore the native inhabitants. From its inception, the Whitman myth, "He saved Oregon," persisted as fulfillment of manifest destiny. But Indigenous historical revisions are appearing, even in the local newspaper. September 26, 2022 issue of the Register Guard. The front page headline and article were a summation of University of Oregon honors students searching at Oregon City for the elusive grave sites of the 5 men who had confessed the murders, were tried, condemned, and hung. Those men known as the Cayuse 5. Catherine was one of the survivors who testified. The project is seeking evidence to restore the humanity of the men and the tragedies visited on them by white men in the guise of Christianity. Our political environment today is even more vindictive than the late 1960s, when non-white citizens began to challenge bigotry. That is the story that Marian asked me to present to you today. I have learned a lot, though, during this time, so I have some thoughts to share. I'm always curious about the people and want to know their stories. So I asked Marian, and she gave me some details, most of which you can find in the Wikipedia entry titled "The Sager Orphans." Now, Catherine married Clark Pringle. They had a farm in Salem where they raised 8 children. They moved to Spokane to be near their youngest daughter. Catherine died there August 10th, 1910. Matilda married a farmer and they had 5 children. After he died, she married Matthew Foltz, a farmer, and they had 3 children and lived in California. She died there April 13th, 1928 at age 89 years. These were some strong women. Elizabeth married William Fletcher Helm, a farmer, in 1855. They had 9 children and lived in Prineville, Oregon, until she moved to Portland, where she died July 18th, 1925 at age 88. Now, not in this picture, Henrietta was originally named Rosanna, but was renamed Henrietta Naomi in honor of her parents, Henry and Naomi, when she lived with the Whitmans. She was placed with her family in Salem and eventually joined her older sisters and lived on the Pringle farm. Later, she joined a traveling troupe of entertainers. She was unhappily married twice and was accidentally shot in a gunfight between her husband and another man at age 26. So, from my own point of view, we're back to the book. At the time of the massacre, Catherine was 9 years old and Matilda was 8 years old. Their memories and subsequent relating of the incident are really, truly remarkable. Catherine's book was published in 1989. So the idea that she could have contributed to the Morrow book, which was first copyrighted in 1926, is very doubtful. I want to note that the book, On to Oregon, is fiction and should be approached with that in mind. Now, the book by Matilda has a copyright of 1920. So I suppose it's possible that Morrow could have used it as a reference. I could not find anything in Morrow's life that placed her in the Northwest, where she could have met either of the Sager sisters. It disturbed me to see on the screen in the opening moments of 7 Alone that Morrow claimed to have had the story of the Sager children related to her by Catherine Sager. Lastly, it was a treat to see an article from the Spokesman Review of August 14th, 1910, found by my intrepid researcher, Sandra Sally, about Matilda and Elizabeth meeting up shortly after the death of Catherine. The newspaper story is correct in every detail as written by the sisters in their book. I can understand why Marian and her mother Calista were upset about the fabrications in their family story after this research. And that is what I have to say. So are there any, I'll try to answer any questions if you have them. There, yes, Rita. I had email contact with Marian Spath, who is the great granddaughter of Catherine Sager. She's very ill. She wanted to come here and present the story herself. This was one of her dearest wishes, and we are going to print her original manuscript and put it in our family history